I want you to picture the sound first. Not the palace, not the crowd, not the uniforms, the sound. Because that's the thing nobody who was there ever forgets. You can lose the faces. You can lose the date. But that flat, ugly crack that rolled across Wexford Park at 11 minutes past 3 on a gray Thursday afternoon, that stays. It gets into you and it does not leave. I know, because I was standing 40 feet from the man this story is about when it happened. And I watched him do the one thing every instinct in a human body screams against. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch, not really. He just held. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Let me tell it the way it happened, because if I jump to the ending you won't understand why grown men and women were crying in the street that day. You won't understand why, 3 weeks later, half the country knew the name of a sergeant who, until that afternoon, had never once been noticed by anyone. So, let me take you back to that morning. Harrogate in early autumn has a particular kind of light. Thin, silver, the sort of light that makes the old stone of the Aldenmere Palace look almost soft, like something you could press your thumb into. Tourists love it. They come in their thousands, cameras up, umbrellas half open because the sky can never quite decide what it's doing. That morning the forecast said rain and the sky said maybe. So the crowd along the palace railings was thick but restless, everyone half expecting to get wet, nobody wanting to leave first. I was there for work. I'm a paramedic was back then, and my crew had been assigned to the perimeter of a small state event happening that afternoon. Nothing dramatic. The young Princess Aloan, 12 years old at the time, was due to open a new children's wing at the Harrogate Infirmary, and the route took her past the west gate of the palace where the changing of the guard happens. Crowds, cameras, a bit of pageantry. Standard stuff. My partner Dev and I were parked in the ambulance bay off Coswell Lane, drinking bad coffee, expecting a slow day. And then there was the guard. You have to understand what the Aldenmere Ceremonial Guard is like if you've never seen them. They stand at the west gate in these long dark coats, tall bearskin caps pulled low, and they do not move. That's the whole discipline of it. They stand. Rain, heat, tourists shouting, children pulling faces, they do not react. It's a kind of theater, but it's also real. These are soldiers. The stillness is the point. That day, the guard at the near post was Sergeant Thomas Gray. I didn't know his name yet. Nobody in that crowd did. To us he was just the guard, the tall one on the left, boots polished to a black mirror, chin up, eyes fixed on nothing. There was a second guard about 30 feet along, a younger lad, and behind them both the usual pair of officers who actually watched the crowd. But Gray was the one closest to the railing, the one the tourists photographed. I remember a family standing right in front of me. A dad, a mum, 2 kids, a boy maybe 10 and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The girl was fascinated by Gray, absolutely transfixed. She kept waving at him, this tiny fluttering wave, going hello, 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 in that high little voice kids have, trying to make him move. He didn't, of course, that's the job. But I only caught this because I was bored and watching, when the girl's balloon slipped out of her hand and started drifting up, and she made this heartbroken little oh. I swear I saw Gray's eyes flick down to her for half a second. Just half a second. A tiny break in the discipline. Then it was gone and he was stone again. I thought there's a human being under all that. I filed it away. I didn't think it mattered. It mattered more than anything. The princess arrived a little after 11. There was a ripple through the crowd before we even saw the cars, that murmur that spreads when people further down the line start pointing. 2 dark vehicles, unhurried, pulling up to the west gate, and then this small figure stepping out. Princess Aloan, 12 years old and clearly trying very hard to look like she did this every day. Navy coat, hair pinned back, a woman from the household walking half a step behind her. She had that stiff, careful posture children get when they know a lot of adults are watching and they've been told exactly how to behave. The plan was simple. She'd walk the short ceremonial path from the cars to the gate, pause for photographs, exchange a word or two with the officer of the guard, and then continue on to the infirmary. 2 minutes tops, a photo opportunity. The crowd loved her. Of course they did. She was a child, she was nervous. She gave this shy little wave and everyone went soft. Even Dev, who is the least sentimental man alive, muttered "Aw, bless her" under his breath. And then something happened that wasn't in the plan. The princess stopped walking. She was maybe 15 feet from the gate, right in front of the guard's post, and she just stopped. The woman behind her nearly walked into her. There was this awkward little stutter in the whole procession. And Aloan was staring at something. Not at the guard. Past him. Through the railings into the forecourt of the palace at a small side door where, and this is the detail I'd swear to in any court, a woman in gray was standing having a hurried, tense conversation with two men I didn't recognize. I didn't know who the woman was. Most of the crowd didn't. But the people near me who followed that sort of thing started whispering, and the whisper that reached me was a name, the Queen Dowager, Margaret, the old king's widow, Aloan's grandmother. The princess had gone very still, very pale. And here's the thing I'll never forget. She turned, this 12-year-old girl, and she looked directly at Sergeant Grey, at the guard, at the one man in that entire courtyard who was under absolute orders to stand still, say nothing, and look at nobody. And she said something to him. I couldn't hear it. I was too far. But I watched her lips move, quick and urgent, and I watched her small hand come up and point back toward that side door, and I watched the officer of the guard step forward with his own face gone tight, reaching for her elbow to move her along, back on schedule, back to the plan. And I watched Sergeant Grey break his stance. Just his head. He turned his head slow and looked where the child was pointing. That doesn't sound like much. If you've never seen the Aldenmere Guard, it sounds like nothing at all. But every single person in that crowd who understood what they were looking at gasped, because that guard does not move. He does not turn his head. In 200 years of that ceremony, a guard turning his head to look at what a frightened child is pointing at is not a small thing. It's an earthquake. The officer barked something. I heard that one sharp word, an order, something like Sergeant Post. Meaning face front, stand down, this is not your business. And Grey didn't. He looked back at the little princess. He looked at her face, and I was close enough now, I drifted forward without noticing, to see that her eyes were wet and her chin was doing that thing a child's chin does right before they cry but are fighting it with everything they have. And whatever he saw in that face, it decided him. Now I have to tell you what I found out later, because in the moment none of us knew any of it. In the moment we just saw a guard doing something impossible and a princess crying, and an officer going red in the face. It looked like chaos. It looked like a scandal about to happen. What was actually happening was this. The men Margaret was talking to by that side door were not palace staff. That came out weeks afterward in the inquiry. They were there to remove something, documents, a whole archive, quietly, before that afternoon's event brought press and cameras crawling all over the grounds. And the reason it had to be quiet was the injustice at the heart of all this. Years before, long before Aloan was born, there had been a fire at a workers' housing terrace on the edge of the royal estate. 9 people died. The official story, the one everyone believed, was a gas fault. A tragic accident. Nobody's fault. Except it wasn't. The land those homes stood on was land the crown had wanted for years. The families had refused to leave. And after the fire, that land was quietly cleared and the family's claims quietly buried, and a young estate official who tried to raise questions was quietly ruined and quietly forgotten. Margaret had known. Not caused it, I want to be fair. The inquiry never found she caused it, but known, and helped bury it, and spent 30 years making sure the paper trail stayed buried. And Aloan had found part of that paper trail, by accident. A child poking around a room she wasn't supposed to be in, finding a locked box, finding letters. A 12-year-old with a curious mind and no idea what she was holding. She'd confronted her grandmother that very morning before the event, and her grandmother had smiled and told her she'd misunderstood and sent her off to cut a ribbon at a hospital, and then moved immediately to have the whole archive taken away before the girl could tell anyone who'd listen. So when Aloan stepped out of that car and saw the men at the side door and understood, with a child's terrible clarity, that the evidence was being carried off right in front of her, she panicked. And the only adult in reach who wasn't part of the household, who wasn't smiling and steering her and telling her she'd misunderstood, was the guard. The one man ordered to ignore her. That's who she reached for. But I didn't know any of that yet. Standing there in the crowd, coffee going cold in my hand, all I knew was that the whole thing had stopped making sense. The officer of the guard had the princess by the elbow now, gently but firmly, and the household woman was on her other side, and between them they were turning her, moving her, smiling for the cameras, doing damage control. This way, ma'am. This way. Smooth. Practiced. The machine closing back up around the crack. And Aloan was looking back over her shoulder at Gray with an expression I have never been able to forget. Betrayal. Pleading. The look of a kid who has just learned that the adults will not help her, that the rules are all built to keep her quiet, that she is alone. And then Sergeant Gray did the second impossible thing. He spoke. The ceremonial guard does not speak. Ever. On duty at that post in front of that crowd, they are silent. It is one of the oldest rules there is. Gray turned fully, boots grinding on the stone, that dark coat swinging, and he faced the officer, and in a voice that carried right across the hushed forecourt because everyone had gone dead quiet, he said, "Sir, the princess is asking for help. I'm not standing down until I know she's safe." You could have heard a pin drop on grass. The officer stared at him. The household woman stared at him. Somewhere in the crowd a camera shutter went off, then another, then 100, that sudden crackle of people realizing they are watching something that is actually happening and not part of the show. And little Aloan, 12 years old, pale, terrified, stopped fighting the hands on her arms and just went still, staring at this enormous stranger in the bearskin cap who had, alone out of every adult in that courtyard, decided that she was worth breaking 200 years of rules for. The officer's face was white with fury. "Sergeant Gray, you will resume your post immediately." And Gray, I'll never forget this. It's carved into me. Gray looked at him steady as stone and said, "No, sir." 2 words. You have to understand what those 2 words cost a man like that. Everything. His career, his pension, his reputation, likely a court-martial, 20-odd years of service. A soldier does not say "no, sir" to a superior officer in front of the world and walk away whole. He knew that. You could see he knew that. His jaw was tight and there was a muscle jumping in his cheek and his hands were not entirely steady. He said it anyway. The forecourt erupted, not into cheering, not yet, into that confused rolling murmur of hundreds of people all turning to each other going, "Did you see that? Did you hear that? What is happening?" And the officer was reaching for his radio, and the household woman was trying to get the princess back to the cars, and the whole careful morning was coming apart at the seams. And that was the exact moment, at 11 minutes past 3, that the world went white and the sound arrived. The bomb had not been meant for the palace. I know that now. Everyone knows that now. It was a device left near the bandstand at the far edge of Wexford Park, 300 yards away across the road, meant for a completely different target, a grubby, tangled thing to do with money and men who have nothing to do with this story. Its timing that afternoon at that moment was pure blind chance. The universe has no sense of decency. It just happens to you. But I didn't know any of that at 11 minutes past 3. At 11 minutes past 3, there was just the white and the sound, and then the strange delay where the world goes silent and slow, and your body hasn't caught up yet. I remember the pigeons going up off the palace roof all at once, this great gray clap of wings. I remember the little girl with the balloon, the one from the morning. I remember her father grabbing her and folding right over her, his whole body a shell. I remember glass, somewhere a lot of glass. And I remember when the world snapped back into speed and the screaming started, and the crowd became a single panicking animal trying to flee in every direction at once. I remember looking for the princess. And I found her. She was on the ground. She'd been knocked down or thrown down in the crush. 12 years old, curled small, and the crowd was surging, and if she stayed down there she was going to be trampled. It was that simple, that was seconds away. And standing over her, feet planted wide, back to the blast, arms out holding back a stampede of grown adults with nothing but his own body and his own refusal to move, was Sergeant Thomas Gray. Bearskin cap gone, face gray with dust, bleeding from somewhere above his ear, a dark line running down into his collar. Holding his post, here's a thing they don't tell you about explosions. The worst part isn't the bang. The bang is over in less than a second. The worst part is what comes after, the long, awful stretch where nobody knows anything. Nobody knows if there's a second one coming. Nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows who's hurt or how badly, and everyone, all at once, decides the only sane thing to do is get away from where they are, right now, by any means. That's what a stampede is. It isn't cruelty. It's 400 frightened animals all making the same reasonable decision in the same half-second, and to hell with anyone who falls. And Princess Eloin had fallen. I was moving before I decided to. That's the training it takes over when your brain goes white. Dev was already ahead of me, this big lad, shoulder down, cutting a wedge through the crowd toward the gate, and I was in his wake, and I could hear myself shouting, "Medic, medic, coming through, medic," in a voice that didn't sound like mine. But we were 40 feet away, and 40 feet in a crowd like that might as well be 40 miles. Gray was already there. I've replayed those next few seconds more times than I can count, and I still don't fully understand how he did what he did. Because think about it. The man had just been blown half off his feet. He was concussed, we'd find that out later, a proper concussion, the kind that has you seeing double and hearing everything through water. He was bleeding from his head. Every instinct he had should have been screaming the same thing everyone else's was screaming: run. Instead, he'd planted himself over a child he barely knew, put his back to the direction the blast had come from, so that, if there was shrapnel, if there was a second device, it went into him and not her, and he'd spread his arms and braced. And people hit him. That's the part that gets me. In a stampede, people don't stop for a wall of one man. They hit him and bounced and hit him again, and he took it, this human breakwater, feet skidding on broken glass, absorbing the whole weight of a terrified crowd across his shoulders and his chest, and he did not go down. "Stay back," I heard him this time over everything. That parade ground voice, cracked but enormous. "She's a child, stay back, G.O. round." And the strangest thing happened. It worked. A little, not all at once, but the people right in front of him, the ones close enough to actually hear a human voice instead of just the animal roar they saw. They saw the guard, the dust, the blood, the little girl curled at his feet, and something human switched back on in them, and they started going around. One, then two, then a dozen, breaking left and right, and a pocket of stillness opened up in the middle of all that chaos like a stone in a river. That pocket of stillness saved her life. I've no doubt about it. If Eloin had been 10 feet further into the crowd, she'd have been trampled inside seconds. Gray bought her the 20 seconds we needed. By the time Dev and I broke through, Gray was down on one knee over her, one arm still up holding the space, the other hand. I'll never forget this, gently, so gently, on the back of the child's head, keeping her tucked, keeping her covered. "She's breathing," he said to me. He'd clocked my uniform in an instant. "Even concussed. She went down under the crowd. I didn't see her hit anything. She's breathing, but she won't answer me." That's a soldier for you. Half his own blood down his collar, and he's giving me a clean handover. I got down beside her. Dev put his back to us and took over holding the space, arms out, that big frame of his, shouting the crowd wide. Eloan was conscious. That was the first thing. Her eyes were open, but she was somewhere else, that flat, faraway shock stare that kids get, and her breathing was quick and shallow and her hands were shaking. "Hey," I said, soft as I could make it over the noise. "Hey, my name's Sam, I'm a paramedic, you're all right. You're all right, sweetheart, I've got you." Nothing, just that stare. And then Gray did the thing that told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was. He leaned down close to her and in this low, steady voice, no parade ground in it now, just warmth, he said, "Princess, it's the guard, remember? You asked me for help. I said I'd stay till you were safe." Her eyes moved, found his face. "I'm still here," he said. "I haven't gone anywhere. This is Sam, and Sam's going to look after you, and I'm going to be right here the whole time. All right." And this 12-year-old girl, in the middle of the worst afternoon of her life, looked up at that battered, bleeding stranger and gave the smallest nod. That nod let me work. Her whole body unlocked just slightly, just enough, and she let me check her over pupils, pulse, the back of her neck, her arms. And she was by some miracle mostly all right, bruised, winded, a shallow cut on her forearm from the glass, deeply, deeply shocked, but nothing broken, nothing bleeding that mattered, no sign of a head injury. She'd gone down soft into people, not onto stone. Lucky, so lucky. The luck was Gray, he was the luck. Now, and this is important, while all this was happening in our little pocket of stillness, the rest of the world was in absolute chaos, and every bit of that chaos was being filmed. Remember those 100 cameras, the ones that had come up when Gray said, "No, sir." They didn't stop when the bomb went off. Half of them kept rolling on pure instinct, phones held over heads, and what they captured from a dozen angles all at once was this. A guard, moments after refusing an order to protect a frightened princess, standing over that same princess in the middle of a bombing, holding back a stampede with his own body. You couldn't script it. Nobody would believe you if you did. By that evening it was everywhere. By the next morning the whole country had watched it 40 times, and a story that had started as "disgraced guard defies orders" flipped, inside a single afternoon, into something else entirely. But I'm getting ahead again, back to the forecourt. The officer of the guard, the one who'd ordered Gray to stand down, I want to tell you he ran. It'd make a neater story, but I have to be fair, because this is a true telling and the truth is more complicated than that. He didn't run. When the bomb went off he'd been knocked flat too, and when he got up, white and shaking, the first thing he did was get on his radio and start doing his actual job, calling it in, getting the gates locked, getting the other guards moving people to the muster points. Whatever I think of the order he gave, in the crisis he stood up. A lot of people froze that day. He didn't. But here's the thing. When he'd finished shouting into his radio, and he turned and saw where Gray was, saw the sergeant kneeling over the princess with his hand on her head, something crossed that officer's face that I've thought about ever since. It was shame. Not anger anymore. Shame. Because he understood in that moment exactly what he'd nearly done. He'd nearly marched that child away from the one person who'd end up saving her. He'd been so busy protecting the schedule that he'd missed the emergency standing right in front of him. And now the whole world was watching the difference between them live. He came over, pushed through to us. And to Gray's credit, this is the measure of the man again. Gray didn't gloat, didn't say a word about the order, didn't do anything but give the officer a fast, clean situation report exactly the way he had with me. Princess is conscious, medics with her. No other casualties in this pocket that I can see, crowds clearing left and right. We need a hard cordon on the gate. The officer nodded, swallowed, and then he said something I don't think he'll ever admit to saying, but I heard it. I was 2 feet away. He said quietly, just to Gray, "You were right, I'm sorry." and Gray, still holding that child's head, said, "Later, sir, cordon first." We got Eloin up. Not far, just onto her feet, wrapped in Dev's high-vis jacket because she was shaking with cold and shock, and me on one side and Gray on the other, walking her back toward the gate where the palace was already opening up to bring her inside to safety. She walked, wobbly, leaning, but she walked, and every step she kept a fistful of Gray's dark coat sleeve bunched in her hand and would not let it go. He didn't try to make her. There's a photograph, you've probably seen it. It went round the world of that exact walk. The little princess, drowning in a paramedic's yellow jacket, blood on her sleeve, and beside her this huge dust-covered guard with his cap gone and blood on his collar, walking so carefully, so slowly, matching her small steps, letting her cling to his arm. People have called it a lot of things, that photo. The papers gave it grand titles, but I was in it, just out of frame, and I'll tell you what it actually was. It was a scared kid and a grown man who decided she mattered more than his own safety and his own career and 200 years of rules. That's all. That's everything. At the gate, the household closed around her again, but different this time. Gentler. The woman who'd been steering her away all morning was crying now, properly crying, reaching for the girl, and behind her, in the shadow of the doorway, was the Queen Dowager. Margaret. I looked at her. I couldn't help it, and I want to describe her face, because it's the hinge the whole rest of this story turns on. She was frightened like everyone, but underneath the fright there was something else, something cold and fast and calculating, and I watched her eyes go from her granddaughter, alive, safe, shaking, to the guard, and then past the guard, out to the crowd, to all those phones, all those cameras, and I watched her do the arithmetic. She understood, before almost anyone, what had just been recorded. She understood that the story was now completely out of her control, and she understood that the child she tried to quietly manage that morning was about to become the most sympathetic, most watched, most believed person in the entire kingdom. You could see the exact second she realized the archive didn't matter anymore, that it was too late to bury anything, that the whole careful 30-year silence had just detonated along with everything else in Wexford Park, and there was no putting it back. She reached out to take Eloin's hand. And Eloin, this is the moment. This is the one the whole country would be talking about by midnight. Eloin looked at her grandmother's outstretched hand, and then looked up at Gray, and then, very deliberately, in front of the cameras, in front of the household, in front of everyone. She stepped closer to the guard, away from her grandmother, toward the stranger. A 12-year-old child made a choice, in complete silence, about who she trusted, and the whole world saw her make it. I have thought a great deal since that day, about how much a small gesture can say. Margaret's hand hung in the air a second too long. Then she lowered it, and she smiled that court smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and she said something warm and meaningless for the cameras about being grateful the princess was safe, and she withdrew back into the palace. Smooth, controlled. To anyone watching on a screen it looked like nothing. But those of us standing there had seen a child flinch away from her own grandmother and hide behind a bleeding soldier. And children don't do that for no reason. Everybody who saw it knew, in their gut, before they knew a single fact, something is very wrong here. The facts came later. The archive, the fire, the 9 dead families, the ruined official, the 30 years of silence, all of that came out over the following weeks, dragged into daylight by an inquiry that only happened because too many people had seen too much to let it be quietly waved away. And when it came out, the country wasn't shocked into it cold. They'd already felt it that afternoon, in the way a scared little girl chose a stranger over her own blood. Eloin's instinct in that forecourt was the first crack in the dam. Everything else poured through after. They took her inside. The gate closed. And for a moment, just a moment, Sergeant Thomas Gray was left standing alone on the forecourt, in the settling dust, cap gone, blood drying on his neck, swaying very slightly on his feet. And that's when I finally got to do my actual job on the man, who'd spent the whole afternoon doing everyone else's. "Right," I said, taking his arm. "Your turn, Sergeant. Sit down before you fall down." He looked at me with those double vision eyes, and I swear to God, the first thing he said, the very first thing after everything was, "Is she safe, properly safe, inside?" "She's safe," I said. "You did that, she's safe." And only then, only when I'd said it, did his legs finally decide they were done, and I had to catch him and lower him down onto the cold stone. This enormous soldier folding up quiet as anything, his job finally, completely done. They wouldn't let me ride with him to the hospital. That sounds like a small thing, and it isn't. When you've knelt on broken glass next to a man and caught him when his legs gave out, you feel a certain responsibility for how the story ends. But there were 3 ambulances at the gate by then, more crews than casualties by some mercy, and protocol is protocol. A different crew took Gray. Dev and I got sent to a cluster of minor injuries near the bandstand: cuts, a broken wrist, an old man who'd fainted. The ordinary wreckage. So I didn't see the sergeant again for 11 days. But I heard about him. Everybody heard about him. By the time my shift ended that night, his face was on every screen in the country, and by the next morning he had a name, not the guard anymore, but Sergeant Thomas Gray, and the whole kingdom was arguing about him. Because here's the strange, ugly truth of it. Even after everything, even after the bomb, the stampede, the rescue, the photograph, there were people, serious people in serious rooms, arguing that Sergeant Gray should face a court-martial. I want you to sit with how mad that is, but I also want to be fair about why. The argument against him wasn't stupid exactly. It went like this. A soldier disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer in public in front of the world. If you let that stand, if you say a guard can decide for himself when the rules don't apply to him, then you've unpicked the whole thread that holds a disciplined service together. Discipline isn't discipline if it's optional. Today, he broke the rules for a good reason. What about the next man with a worse one? That was the case. And there were old, senior, stone-faced men who made it, and they weren't villains for making it. They believed it. But they'd forgotten something. They'd forgotten that the country had watched. Every angle, every phone, every replay. The country had seen a man refuse to stand down, and then seen exactly what he refused to stand down for. And you cannot tell a nation that has watched a soldier shield a child with his own body that the soldier is the one in the wrong. It doesn't matter how good your argument is. The country had already decided, and it had decided the moment that little girl stepped away from her grandmother and grabbed a fistful of a stranger's coat. So while the stone-faced men convened their inquiry, something else was happening out in the open, and it was moving faster than they were. The story of the fire was coming out. It came out sideways, the way these things do. A journalist, one of the good ones, the patient kind, had been at the gate that afternoon, and she'd seen the same thing I'd seen, a child flinching from her own grandmother. And unlike most people, she didn't let the feeling fade. She went looking for why. Why would a 12-year-old on a day of terror choose a bleeding stranger over her own family? She started pulling threads. The princess had been at the palace that morning before the event, off schedule. There'd been a locked room, a box of old letters. There'd been men at a side door, moving documents. At the exact moment the princess arrived, men who turned out not to be palace staff at all. And there'd been 30 years back a fire on the edge of the royal estate. 9 dead. A gas fault. A cleared plot of valuable land. A young estate official named Peter Halloran who'd asked too many questions and found himself, within a year, unemployed, discredited, and quietly written out of every record. She found Peter Halloran. He was an old man by then, living small and bitter in a town by the coast, and he'd spent 30 years being told he'd imagined the whole thing. And she sat with him, and she listened, really listened, the way nobody in power ever had, and she believed him. And then Princess Aloan, 12 years old, did the bravest thing in this entire story. Braver than the guard, I sometimes think, though he'd be the first to say so. She told the truth about her grandmother, out loud, on the record. You have to understand what that cost a child. Gray risked his career. Serious, real, but a career is a career. Elowen risked her family. She stood in front of the inquiry. They let her give evidence privately, in a quiet room, no cameras, and this little girl described finding the letters, described confronting her grandmother that morning, described being smiled at and told she'd misunderstood, and sent off to cut a ribbon while the evidence was carried out the back door. She named the Queen Dowager, her own grandmother, knowing what it would do to the family she loved, knowing the papers would tear it all apart, knowing her grandmother would never forgive her. She did it anyway, because 9 families had died and been called an accident for 30 years, and she was the only one who'd found the proof, and she decided, this 12-year-old had decided, that the dead mattered more than her own comfort. When I read her testimony, later, in the parts they made public, I understood something about that morning I hadn't understood before. When she reached for the guard through those railings, when she pointed at that side door with tears in her eyes, she wasn't a frightened kid looking for any adult. She was looking for the right adult, the one who wouldn't smile and steer her and tell her she'd misunderstood. And out of everyone in that courtyard, the one she picked was the one man ordered to ignore her. And he'd looked at her face and chosen, in a heartbeat, to be worthy of it. 2 people, a child and a soldier, who both decided the same thing on the same afternoon, that some rules are less important than the truth in front of you. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is detail. The inquiry into the fire took the better part of a year, and I won't drag you through all of it. Here's what mattered. They found that the fire had been an accident after all, a genuine gas fault, no arson, no murder. That part of the darkest rumors turned out not to be true, and I'm glad because the truth was ugly enough without it. What they found was that after the fire, the Crown had seen an opportunity and had taken it. The land was cleared. The family's claims for their lost homes, their compensation, their memory, were buried. Peter Halloran was destroyed for objecting. And Margaret, then a younger woman close to power, had been one of the hands that did the burying, and had spent 3 decades keeping it buried. Not a murderer, something quieter and in a way worse, someone who'd looked at 9 grieving families and decided their grief was inconvenient and made it disappear. The Queen Dowager was never charged with a crime because keeping secrets is not in itself a crime, but she was finished all the same. She withdrew from public life entirely. The families, the survivors, the descendants got their apology at last, a real one, read aloud, 30 years too late but real. Peter Halloran got his name back before he died. I'm told he wept when they told him. I'm not surprised. 30 years is a long time to be called a liar. And it all happened because a little girl found a box, and a guard turned his head. Now, Sergeant Gray. The court-martial never happened. I'd love to tell you it was because wiser heads prevailed, or because someone gave a great speech about honor. But I think the honest reason is simpler and a bit more disappointing. The palace understood that putting Thomas Gray on trial, after everything the country had seen, would be a public relations catastrophe from which nothing could be salvaged. You do not court-martial the man the entire nation is calling a hero, not if you want to survive the week. So they found a face-saving path. His disobedience was quietly reclassified, not as insubordination, but as a soldier exercising judgment in a developing emergency, which, once you thought about it honestly, is exactly what it was. The order to stand down had been given before anyone understood there was a real threat. Gray had simply understood it first. That was the official finding, and I think it was even mostly true. He wasn't punished, but and this is the part I find myself thinking about most, he didn't come out of it a decorated golden hero either, not really. Something in him had shifted. The concussion took months to fully clear, and I think a man who has said no, sir, to his whole world and had it come out right is changed by it whether it comes out right or not. He'd learned something about himself that afternoon that he couldn't unlearn. He didn't go back to the gate. He requested a transfer, away from the ceremonial guard, away from the cameras, out to a training role where he taught young soldiers. I heard he was good at it. I'm not surprised by that either. The last time I saw them together was almost a year after the bomb. There was a small ceremony, not the grand kind, a small one for the emergency crews and staff who'd been at Wexford Park that day. They gave us a bit of a medal, which was kind and slightly embarrassing. I went mostly because Dev wanted to, and I didn't want him standing there alone in a suit that didn't fit him. And Gray was there out of uniform in a plain dark coat, looking smaller than I remembered without the bearskin cap, the way they always do. Older too, but well, steady. And near the end, a girl came in. 13 now, taller. Less of the frightened child and more of the young woman she was becoming, with something set and serious behind her eyes that hadn't been there before, the look of someone who's learned young that the world will lie to you and you have to decide what to do about it. Princess Elowen. She came straight across the room, past all the officials, past all the people who wanted a word, and she went a Gray. And she didn't do anything grand. She didn't make a speech. She just stood in front of him and looked up, less far up than a year ago, and she said something quiet that I was, once again, just close enough to hear. She said, "You stayed." 2 words, same as his 2 words a year before in that courtyard. "No, sir," and now hers, "You stayed." And Sergeant Thomas Gray, who had faced down an officer and a stampede and a bomb and a whole inquiry without his voice breaking once, looked down at that girl and had to clear his throat twice before he could answer her. "I said I would," he said, "till you were safe." She nodded, that same small nod from the forecourt floor. And then she smiled, the first time I'd ever seen her really smile. And the 2 of them just stood there a moment, the child and the soldier, not needing to say anything else, because everything that mattered had already been said a year before, on a gray Thursday afternoon, by 2 people who both decided at the same moment that some things matter more than the rules. People ask me sometimes when they find out I was there, they ask what the lesson is, what it all means, as if a thing like that has to mean one clean thing you can put on a card. I never know quite what to tell them, but if you pushed me, I'd say this. We spend our whole lives being told to stand down. Not so dramatically, most of us, just quietly. Look away. Don't make a fuss. It's not your business. Stay in your lane, stand at your post, keep your eyes front. And most of the time we do because it's easier and because the people telling us usually outrank us and because breaking ranks costs something and we're tired. But every now and then, a frightened voice reaches for you through the railings, and you have a half-second to decide whether you're the kind of person who turns your head or the kind who keeps your eyes front and tells yourself it wasn't your business. Sergeant Thomas Gray turned his head. That's all he did, in the end. He turned his head when a child asked him to, and everything else followed from that one small refusal to look away. I think about that more than I think about the bomb. I hope if the day ever comes for me, I turn my head too.